Welcome to another episode of Code for Thought. My guest in this episode is Ghislain Vaillant. At the time of recording, Ghislain was working at the Brain Institute or Institut du Cerveau in Paris. The institute is located in the heart of one of Europe's largest hospitals, if not the largest, the Hôpital de la Pitié Salpetrière in the 13th district of the French capital. I was in Paris when the interview happened and I had the privilege of meeting Ghislain on site. We started discussing his work on providing support and infrastructure for machine learning applications in neuroscience. But our conversation turned to more personal matters midway, because I think that Ghislain has a very interesting career path and the fact that he switched between public and private sector roles resonates with me. We touched on a number of things like how big events like COVID and Brexit impacted our lives and careers, and how research software engineering careers in general differ between countries like France and the UK, as Ghislain will explain in the following conversation. But first we had to sort out some pronunciation issues. Hello, Ghislain. I hope Ghislain is the right way to pronounce it.
It's Ghislain.
Ghislain.
But I mean, almost 10 years in the UK and no one has ever spelled it properly, so I can't.
So my apologies.
I can't blame you on this.
It's not a good start then. Ghislain. Ghislain. Hello, Ghislain.
Hello, Peter.
And thank you very much for your time today.
My pleasure.
It's great to be in Paris here at one of the biggest hospitals, certainly the biggest one in France, isn't it?
Yes, in France and I believe in Europe, I've read at some point, yes.
Yeah, and we're sitting here in the Institut du Cerveau.
So formerly Institut du Cerveau et de la Moelle Épinière, that's why the acronym is ICM.
Okay.
It's been rebranded as Institut du Cerveau, just short, or Paris Brain Institute for the international audience.
Okay. And we haven't actually given you an opportunity to introduce yourself, so why don't you just do that?
Yes, so I'm Ghislain Vaillant. I'm a research software engineer currently employed by the CNRS, which is the National Research Center from France, one of the multiple governmental institutions that fund research in France. And I'm employed here at the Paris Brain Institute in a research team called RMIS, where in this team we focus on modeling diseases, progression, and training machine learning models on neuroimaging datasets.
Okay, it's for neurological disease, mainly
yes.
or only?
So, yeah, we mostly focus on things like Alzheimer's. There's a bit of Parkinson's as well, I remember. So yeah, and this institute deals with more than this. So there's part of the institute that does image acquisition. So they deal with MRI scanners and PET scanners. And there are other part of the institute that deals with finding new agents to detect disease in biological samples, for instance. So it's the range of the domain knowledge of the institute is quite broad.
All right, and it's quite a big building too. And you mentioned MRI imaging, which is down in the basement at level -1. And you told me earlier it goes down to -5.
Yeah, -4, -5. Yeah, it is very big.
So your work encompasses more or less machine learning and modeling, or how can we envisage the work that you do?
So that's the scope of the lab, and then inside the lab, the research teams, so the actual researchers and PhD students and postdocs, they focus, I would say, more on the modeling aspects, so building the actual machine models, whereas I deal with the tooling aspect that helps them do that. So as a research software engineer, my prerogatives are to design the tools that will help this research. One of the projects I work on is a software project called Clinica. This is a software project that was completely incubated in the lab. So initially it was just a centralized toolbox for all the pre-processing that was required for the data to be then fed to machine learning models.
Right. Like building a data pipeline or data cleaning.
Absolutely. Exactly. So you start from, we usually deal with public data sets for neuroimaging data, but these public data sets, they're usually not normalized, or sometimes they also provide multiple versions of the same data. So we needed to design a set of tools to actually decide and normalize what are the highest quality data to pick and how to name them, pre-process them, convert them sometimes. And then we also have a few pre-processing directives that happens to derive some more data from them. We're going to, for instance, create segmentation maps of the brain out of these images so that we can label for each voxel in the image in which part of the brain they belong. We are going to register them to a standardized space to do our analysis, for instance. All these sorts of pre-processing pipelines that needs to happen anyway before any kind of modeling. And as a matter of fact, at some point we realized that it could be beneficial to the rest of the community. So Clinica was open sourced quite a while ago, I think 5 years ago or something. And we now have a team of one permanent researcher and 2 researchers on contract, including myself, working full-time on this piece of software.
Well, I think there's a lot to unpick in what you've just said. Let's start from scratch. So did you start with a blank page when you say we're designing the infrastructure for this data pipeline?
So I joined the group 2 years ago. So the software project was already well on track. So I can't really comment on the actual complete inception of the code base of the project. I'd said the overall infrastructure was already in place, which is basically to have a command line interface on which we can give an input data set, a few parameters to control the behavior of the processing pipeline, and a target directory to write the resulting pre-processed data set. So all the pipelines more or less follow this structure. And the nice thing is because it's written in Python, it's fairly easy to deploy, just a pip install away, I would say. That being said, we piggyback on a lot of tools written from other labs, which are sometimes not even written in Python. Some of them are written in C++ or other languages. So what makes these pipelines tricky to write is that we need to orchestrate between pure Python processing and processing coming from these command line tools that we have no control over.
How closely do you work with the data scientists and how much input do they give you?
It depends. So there are something we have going for ourselves in the neuroimaging community is that very early on, there's been efforts to standardize the format of the data we would exchange between different tools. Nowadays, the data format we use is called BIDS for brain imaging data structure, although these days we could even drop the brain because it's applicable to, I would say, any medical modalities. Historically, because of the neuroimaging background, it was named that way. There's a proper specification body and a proper, like an official spec online that everyone, all the community worldwide works on to bring all these expertise coming from everyone, from the functional MRI side, from the structural MRI side, from the microscopy, from the EEG, ECG, all these people basically bring their expertise to say, in our research, this is the data formats we use, and this is the sort of queries, the metadata that we need to run our studies. So we are lucky that for the most part, as long as the normalization is done properly and that people are aware of the spec, you still need to keep track with the specifications as it progresses. We only need to say, for instance, I'm going to need some discrete segmentation of the brain. Well, we look at the spec and there is already a way to say if you need to work with discrete segmentations of the brain, this is how the data should be formatted. Actually, my work is a bit more on keeping up with the spec to make sure that our corners are properly covered. If they are not, bringing this to the community and say, could we work on this? For instance, there's an effort these days to bring provenance to the specs. So basically to say, I process the source data. I've created this derivative data, and I need a mean to also express that there's a record that these derivative data have been processed from this specific version of the source data,
Right.
and with this specific piece of software, with these specific flags, so that if I rerun the same study with the same commands, I should normally get the same results.
One would hope.
One would hope that's all the work on replicability and reproducibility that happens in the research community these days. But also a way to say, if I replicate this pre-processing with different parameters, then I effectively get a new derivative data set from the very same source data. And if I don't encode this provenance information, then if I'm given these data sets without this information, I'm unable to say which is what. So I'd say it's more, we don't get that much specifications from the researchers, but we are more like the driving force saying this is how your data should be structured, or this is how you should expect your data coming after normalization, so that you can then plug this to your framework of choice, TensorFlow, PyTorch, JAX, whatever.
And it also involves a lot of community work that you just already alluded to, because you need to reach out to other teams here in France and probably worldwide that are involved in the standardization or in the attempt to standardize the data formats.
Indeed, yes. I remember at the time when I heard the 4 bits, the very first time I heard of it, it was back when I was at Imperial, I think it was in 2016, something like that, so it's a while back. And at the time, it was someone from the US who visited to say, I started this initiative, and I think you should be aware of it. Since you're a neuroimaging lab, you should, if you want to have an idea of how to structure your data set, this is one proposal that I'm trying to push forward to the rest of the community. And almost 10 years later, this has become the lingua franca of the neuroimaging tools these days. Like, we have a conference run every year called OHBM, and we have a dedicated time there where the community joins together from worldwide, and we think on the development of the spec and where it's getting, what are the new modalities that we're bringing in, what are the ones that need polish. Sometimes also it's a volunteer-based project, so as any projects in research. So sometimes people start a proposal but don't finish it. So it's also a time to check what's the status of the different proposals. But overall, yes, we are quite fortunate to be in a research field where there is a value in finding a way to normalize data so that all tools can then interoperate more easily than if they weren't.
The other subject that I want to pick up on is what you mentioned earlier with open source. Isn't there a rule in France that research projects that are funded to, say, more than 50% have to be open source?
It is indeed. It depends on the institution that funds you. So we regularly have questions sent to the developers mailing list about what's my copyright, what's my licensing, what should I use as a license for this body of work. But overall, yes, there's a requirement for having code that is mostly funded by public money to be open source. And there's, if I remember well, there's a list of recommended licenses that are proposed. I know also that even the government, the French government, actually is very much involved in open source and is open sourcing more and more code as well.
It's quite interesting to actually see that happening.
The other thing is that there is a recognition that we need to stand on the shoulders of giants. We can't have this completely closed piece of software where we own the stack from bottom to up, but it requires a lot of engineering time and money is quite scarce in research. And another thing is people come and go.
Indeed.
Researchers in France, they're usually hired, research software engineers are usually hired on short-term contracts ranging from a year, 2 years, sometimes 3 after an extension. So you also can't commit to very, very, very long-term projects unless they become so big that then a consortium is created or a community is built that then the project can kind of survive without the backup of the host lab or the host team that bootstrapped it. I'm thinking, for instance, of like scikit-learn, which is like this very known project nowadays, but it has reached such a community now that it could probably self-sustain itself at some point.
Yeah. Going back to the positions of research software engineers in France, I find that quite interesting because you actually have a career you had a career in the UK. So you did a degree at King's?
So I did my PhD at King's from 2010 to 2014. And then I moved to RSE positions, a year at my host lab at King's, and then almost 2 years and a half at Imperial, before afterwards joining the private sector. It was about at that time where I could see some communications about recognizing RSEs as the proper contribution to science. I think it was at the time where like the first grant for RSEs happened. Whereas in France, RSEs are state workers.
Yeah, indeed, but only temporary ones, it seems.
Yes, so the caveat is that you cannot actually become permanent. You usually start on short-term contracts, rarely get hired directly as an RSE. Right. The way it works is that every year, each of the research councils, so CNRS, INRIA, INSERM, in RAE, and there's many, publish their list of permanent positions that they are advertising. And you basically apply to a concours, which is similar to a university examination.
Okay.
It is very similar. The idea is you pass that concours, and if you pass it, you're officially employed as a state worker. So this time you're employed on a permanent contract by the state, which is nice because you have that safety that you're going to be doing research software engineering for possibly the rest of your career. Whereas I remember that in London, I mean, I was fortunate enough that I had a PI with deep pockets, but I think I've hopped on from one funding body to another like 6 or 8 times when I was at Imperial, because you had to find money left from grant to another for these sort of positions to be funded.
It's gradually changing. Luckily in the UK, a number of universities now have permanent positions. I mean, there is no such thing as a state position like in France, but it's moving gradually. But actually, you haven't got one of those state positions.
No, I'm actually applying for these concours. I did last year. Once I failed at the final stage, sadly. Hopeful for this year. But the other thing is also depends on which positions are open. You might have a few positions in robotics, in health tech. It highly depends on what's open. So you might be in a year where there's not going to be a position open in your specific field. So either you decide to bypass this year and try your luck next year, or you decide to go to another field. But yes, the way it works, it depends from the funding body, but usually you basically do a written application, which is like a very big cover letter, but where you describe how you're fit as a permanent research engineer. So you justify your choice of career and your achievements with respect to how it fulfills the official job description for being a research software engineer. That's also something that we have for us, is that in the website of the Ministry of Research, there is an official job description of what a research software engineer is. So we know what are the official prerogatives and requirements. So you write this giant cover letter with this job description in mind. And then if you qualify, then you go to the next stage, which usually is composed of at least an oral exam in front of a jury, where you present yourself and you're questioned by a jury representing the research council who's going to hire you full time. And you're going to be talking in front of an audience that is both technical but also not HR, like many people actually.
Yeah. How big is the panel? Is it sort of 10 people then? Or?
I think the one I passed, there were 9 people. But also mine, there was a written exam, proper of written exam like you would pass at university. You're given problems, situational problems, questions about software development.
Technical questions.
Yes.
Okay.
And you have 3 hours to do that exam, and then you get a mark. You get a mark from your cover letter, your written exam, your oral exam, and basically whoever gets the highest mark gets the job.
That's quite involved. It's quite unusual. I'm glad we talked about this because, as you say, in the UK, it's a very different approach. So what made you go then to academia, and why imaging? Why medical imaging?
So imaging was, I would say, maybe an accident. I come from an engineering background, and very early on I was interested in the technical aspect, but I wasn't really sure in what domain I wanted to apply it.
Right.
So I did a Master of Research in Medical Imaging just out of curiosity. Then I got an internship in Siemens in the US doing just implementation of algorithms applied to medical imaging. That got me thinking, what do I need to do to keep doing medical imaging full-time afterwards? And I was told if you want to be specialized in that field, you should be doing a PhD in that field. Because yes, you need to be actually trained into dealing with the physics, the technical aspect, the image analysis. And they were right. There's a huge variety of things to be trained on before really being called an expert, quote unquote, in medical imaging. And I found a position, initially it was for doing both MRI and ultrasound concurrently. It just so happens that the ultrasound aspect, the actual probe that we were supposed to work didn't really work that well, so it became a full MRI PhD, and I worked in motion correction applied in MRI, and I really liked hacking the MRI scanners to make them do what they were not supposed to do, and there were some very, very scary things happening sometimes, but I really, really enjoyed the technical aspect of it. And I was less interested in the actual publishing and I'd say the more academic side of it, which got me convinced to focus on that part. And at that time, my PhD supervisor told me, I've got this grant coming up. It's a very short one. It's a year. But where you're going to be paid to actually work just on the technical tools. I think it was labeled as like working on translational work, bridging research to tooling, something like that.
So the technical aspect was written into the grant.
Yes, exactly. And I really liked it, but it was only a year, and then I looked for similar positions to pursue this career. There was actually one at UCL as well, so I had the choice between UCL and Imperial, and I really liked the project at Imperial, so I joined them, and there was a hell of a lot to do, and I worked on bootstrapping the RSE group, or the RSE, let's say, community there, because it was not even a group at the time. And then I left to the private sector more for monetary reasons.
Yes.
I think that will speak to many people.
No, exactly. We have to talk about money at some stage.
I mean, at some point when you start having a family, you also have to pay the bills, and London is pretty expensive in that regard. So I went to the private sector. It was in a company doing ophthalmology.
Okay, so it was still related.
Still related. Okay. Well, yes, it wasn't. It was still medical imaging at its core.
Okay,
And then actually I had to come back to France because of Brexit, which will also probably speak to other people. And then I joined other companies in France. The issue is that I didn't have the network to join research in France. I was still willing to go back to the health and medical sector, which I eventually did in the company I joined before coming back to academia. But then during the pandemic, I was like, I want to give research another spin. And that's how I found the research software engineering position from CNRS here at the Institute.
It's quite an upheaval, isn't it? We talked about it before this interview, a little bit about the changes that particularly the last few years brought about. I mean, you mentioned the pandemic. And then you mentioned Brexit. That's quite a lot to take in, that more or less upended our lives, but hopefully for the better. So what's in store for you next? So you mentioned the next round of concours.
That's my current focus. Normally the next round of positions available will be released in the next few months. So once they are officially published, I will start preparing for the concours. In the meantime, there's these international collaborations that I'm working with on a software project called Hydra, which is the core of what Clinica is using nowadays. So we've decided to also spend more resources, more engineering resources, helping the community by investing ourselves in this open source community. So I hope to further enhance that part as well. But I have to say, yes, I didn't see myself coming back to research software engineering after leaving Imperial, just because, first of all, the difference in money between academia and the private sector, especially in London, was like quite a massive leap.
Yes.
In France, it is much less so. I managed now to be comfortable with living with less, but being in a job that I love. I mean, I love research, and I wouldn't see myself really working with other people than researchers. So that's why even if I would join the private sector, I would probably join a research and development team or kind of position, just because they're the sort of people I like collaborating with. But as a matter of fact, research software engineering in France, although we are vastly underfunded, is very much enjoyable.
Actually get some insight on how things work in France. It seems on one level very different, so you have these state roles, but on the other hand, it's quite similar in the challenges in terms of funding and recognition, I guess. Or do you feel that in terms of recognition, you're better off here in France than you were in the UK?
I mean, at least the fact that it is an officially recognized position with an officially published job description, since our prerogatives are known, we can easily look at all the bullet points of what's expected from us. I mean, I can walk you through these very briefly. In addition to the technical support we bring to the lab we're working in, we're also supposed to train the research lab into the technical aspects of doing their job. So this training can range from basics of source control, for instance, all the way up to the physics of MRI, if you need to know them. We're supposed to bring, in addition to the purely technical work, also this technical knowledge that we are ready to distill to the rest of the lab. And we're also supposed to help with the outreach of the works of the lab to the rest of the communities, both nationally and internationally. I mean, in the private sector, for instance, due to my seniority, I was often the technical referent for Python or databases or whatever. But it was somewhat unofficial. It's within your team. Was in research in France. That's expected from any research software engineer because it's in their job description. Then, of course, it's also up to your PI to allocate your time on the technical projects and on technical outreach and on technical teaching. It's CNRS who employs me, but that being said, it's my PI who runs the project.
The day-to-day management.
Exactly. So my time is allocated by my PI. But yes, there is definitely this aspect. And for instance, we have initiatives within INRIA, which is another closely related research institution in France, which organizes meetings between all research software engineers within nationally. For instance, in my field, which is the health and medical sector, to gather around and work on interoperability of the tools we develop, on teaching each other, so reaching out to our different expertise. I have expertise in data normalization in neuroimaging, for instance. We have people with expertise in federated learning, some people with expertise in PACS systems, patient data at scale. Yeah, it is very nice to be able to gather all around as research software engineers and share this common knowledge so that then afterwards we can spread this knowledge to our respective teams, or also be able to say, oh, if you need knowledge in that particular field, you should reach out with the teams in Lyon, Nice, Strasbourg, etc.
We've come to the end of the interview now. Thank you so much for your time. All the best for the future.
Cheers, Peter.
Well, Ghislain finally entered the permanent engineering selection process after our interview. We were meant to meet up again, but he was just heads down preparing for the interview panels and the exams. But I'm pleased to say his efforts have paid off, and in January 2024, he will start his new career. So good luck to him. Oh, time's up. See you next time. But before I forget, this podcast is covered by the Creative Commons license. See ya.